The fastest way to discover someone's character is to watch how they treat a stranger they think has no authority. That thought crossed my mind the exact second I saw Linda Parker standing in the middle of my driveway with one hand on her hip and the other holding a cell phone aimed directly at me. The quiet suburban street had barely awakened. Freshly cut grass filled the cool morning air. A sprinkler clicked steadily across the yard next door while robins hopped between neatly trimmed flower beds. I had just returned from an overnight inspection at a nearby military logistics facility, driving my dusty gray pickup truck into the driveway of the house I had owned for almost 3 years. I was tired, still wearing faded blue jeans, worn work boots, and a simple navy jacket without a single military insignia anywhere on it. That was exactly how I preferred it. Outside the base, I never introduced myself by rank. I believed respect should come before titles, not because of them. Before I could even switch off the engine, Linda marched toward the front of my truck and raised her hand as if she were directing traffic. Her expression carried complete confidence, the kind that comes from believing you are protecting your neighborhood from someone who clearly does not belong. She never asked my name. She never asked whether I lived there. Instead, she demanded to know why I had parked in someone else's driveway. I calmly explained that this was my home. She laughed as though I had told the most unbelievable joke she had ever heard. Then she looked around at several neighbors who had stepped onto their porches after hearing raised voices and confidently announced that she had never seen me before, which somehow proved I could not possibly own the property. I quietly reached toward the center console where my wallet rested, intending to show my driver's license with the matching address, but she took 2 quick steps backward and announced that she had already called the police because she believed I was trespassing. The only sound that followed was the distant cry of a mourning dove and the soft hum of my truck engine idling in the driveway. I simply nodded, turned off the ignition, stepped out of the truck, and leaned casually against the driver's door. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. Years of military leadership had taught me that calmness often revealed far more than confrontation ever could. Within minutes, the unmistakable sound of approaching sirens echoed through the neighborhood. A patrol vehicle slowly rolled onto my street as curious neighbors gathered quietly along sidewalks and front lawns, whispering to one another while watching the situation unfold. Linda greeted the responding officers before they even reached my driveway, confidently explaining that she had caught an unknown man attempting to occupy a home that did not belong to him. I remained exactly where I was, hands visible, relaxed, and cooperative. One officer approached politely and asked if I would be willing to answer a few questions. I smiled, said absolutely, and reached for my identification. What none of them knew, including Linda, was that before the next day ended, she would receive an official summons directing her to report to my command office, where the assumptions she had made in less than 5 minutes would be measured against the truth she had never imagined. My name is Ethan Brooks. I was 44 years old when that quiet morning changed the way my entire neighborhood looked at me, although none of them understood why until much later. I had spent more than 2 decades serving in the United States military, beginning as a young officer who believed leadership meant giving orders, and eventually learning that real leadership meant listening first and speaking last. Every promotion brought greater responsibility, not greater privilege. By the time I accepted command of a regional military logistics organization, I had learned to leave my rank at the gate whenever I drove home. My uniform stayed neatly pressed inside my office. My neighbors saw only a man who mowed his own lawn, carried groceries without expecting help, waved to children riding bicycles, and spent Saturday mornings washing an aging pickup truck instead of driving an expensive luxury vehicle. That was exactly the life I wanted. 3 years earlier, I had purchased the house because it offered something I rarely found during my career. It was quiet. Tall oak trees lined the sidewalks. Families gathered for neighborhood cookouts during the summer, and the sound of children playing basketball echoed through the evenings instead of traffic or aircraft. After years of frequent relocations, the neighborhood felt like the first place where I could simply be another homeowner instead of another commanding officer. I intentionally avoided discussing my work with anyone outside the installation. When neighbors asked what I did for a living, I usually smiled and answered that I worked in government logistics. The explanation was truthful, simple, and never invited unnecessary attention. Most people appreciated that answer and moved on to discussing gardening, football, or weekend projects. I preferred those conversations because they reminded me that ordinary life was worth protecting. My father had served in the army before me, and he often repeated that respect earned through kindness lasted much longer than respect demanded through authority. That lesson stayed with me throughout my career. I carried groceries for elderly neighbors, helped jump dead car batteries during winter mornings, and loaned tools whenever someone needed them. I never expected anyone to know what happened after I drove through the security gates each weekday before sunrise. That separation mattered to me. Home was where I rested, not where I exercised authority. Looking back, I realized that my decision to remain anonymous had unintentionally created the perfect conditions for misunderstanding. Linda Parker had lived across the street for nearly 15 years and knew almost every family on the block. She organized neighborhood gatherings, welcomed new residents, and often believed it was her responsibility to notice anything that seemed unusual. Unfortunately, familiarity sometimes became certainty, and certainty sometimes replaced simple questions. Because my work often required travel, there were weeks when my driveway remained empty while I visited installations across several states. To someone watching from a front porch every afternoon, I probably seemed like a stranger appearing at unpredictable times. I never imagined that quiet privacy could eventually become the reason someone questioned whether I belonged inside my own home. But that morning proved how quickly assumptions could grow whenever people believed appearances told the entire story. Linda Parker believed every neighborhood needed someone willing to notice what everyone else ignored, and for nearly 15 years, she had happily accepted that role without anyone officially giving it to her. She was 53 years old, lived directly across the street from my house, and rarely missed anything happening on our block. Every morning, she walked the same route with a cup of coffee in one hand and her small terrier on a bright red leash in the other. She knew which families left for work before sunrise, which children caught the school bus, and which homeowners forgot to bring in their trash cans after collection day. Most of my neighbors appreciated her friendly conversations and willingness to organize holiday decorations or neighborhood picnics. But over time, those helpful habits slowly evolved into something else. Linda began believing that familiarity gave her authority. She introduced herself to delivery drivers, questioned unfamiliar contractors working on nearby homes, and occasionally called the local police department whenever she felt something looked out of place. She genuinely believed she was protecting the community, and because nothing serious had ever happened in our quiet subdivision, many people simply accepted her confidence without questioning it. Unfortunately, confidence and accuracy are not always the same thing. During the weeks I traveled for work, Linda often mentioned to other neighbors that my house seemed strangely empty. She noticed my truck disappearing for several days at a time and assumed nobody could possibly maintain a normal life while being away so frequently. She did not know that military inspections regularly required overnight travel across multiple installations. She never asked. Instead, she quietly built her own explanation from scattered observations. One afternoon, I overheard two neighbors discussing me while checking their mail. One wondered whether I worked for a government contractor. The other guessed I might be a commercial truck driver. Linda confidently interrupted both suggestions, insisting that nobody really knew anything about me because I kept to myself too much. Hearing that conversation made me smile rather than offend me. Everyone has a right to wonder about unfamiliar things, and I had intentionally chosen privacy over attention. What I did not realize was how firmly Linda had convinced herself that she understood my situation better than the facts actually supported. During the weeks leading up to that morning, she became increasingly attentive whenever unfamiliar vehicles entered the neighborhood. She wrote down license plate numbers she did not recognize, waved down utility workers to ask which house they were visiting, and even reminded a landscaping company that homeowners appreciated advance notice before heavy equipment arrived. None of those actions seemed malicious by themselves. Viewed individually, they appeared almost neighborly. Together, however, they revealed someone who had gradually replaced simple curiosity with personal certainty. By the time my dusty pickup truck rolled into my own driveway after another overnight assignment, Linda had already decided that an unfamiliar face climbing out of an older truck could not possibly belong in one of the neighborhood's well-kept homes. She never considered asking a single calm question before reaching for her telephone because, in her mind, the answer had already been decided long before the first police cruiser turned onto our quiet street. The first patrol vehicle rolled to a smooth stop beside my mailbox, its flashing lights reflecting softly across the windows of nearby homes, while curious neighbors quietly gathered on their front porches pretending not to watch. Two officers stepped out with calm, professional expressions that immediately told me they intended to understand the situation before reaching any conclusions. I appreciated that. Experience had taught me that good professionals asked questions first and formed opinions later. The senior officer walked toward me while his partner remained several feet behind, taking in the surroundings without appearing confrontational. I kept both hands visible and greeted them with a polite good morning before they even spoke. The officer returned the greeting and explained that they had received a report concerning possible trespassing at the residence. I simply nodded and replied that I understood why they had been dispatched because someone had called, but I also explained that the property belonged to me and that I would gladly provide whatever documentation they needed. Before I could retrieve my wallet, Linda confidently stepped forward and interrupted the conversation. She insisted that she had lived across the street for years, had never seen me before, and was certain I was making up a story to avoid being removed from the property. The officers listened respectfully without accepting her conclusion as fact. One of them turned back toward me and asked whether I had identification showing my current address. I carefully removed my wallet, handed him my driver's license, and waited patiently while he examined it. His eyes moved from the card to the house numbers displayed beside my front door, then back to the address printed on the license. Everything matched perfectly. Even so, he remained thorough and asked whether I had recently purchased the home. I explained that I had owned it for 3 years, but traveled frequently because of my work. He thanked me and entered information into the computer inside the patrol vehicle while his partner continued speaking with Linda. Although I could not hear every word, I noticed the younger officer politely reminding her that residency alone did not establish ownership and that they were verifying the facts before making any determination. Linda folded her arms and appeared frustrated that the situation was not ending as quickly as she expected. Several more neighbors had wandered outside by then, quietly exchanging uncertain glances as they watched events unfold. A few recognized me and offered small waves from their driveways, but nobody interrupted the officers. After several minutes, the senior officer returned carrying my identification. His expression had changed almost imperceptibly. It was not surprise exactly, but the careful look of someone who had noticed a detail requiring additional verification. He thanked me again for my cooperation and asked one more question in a respectful tone. He wanted to know where I worked because one of the database entries connected to my identification indicated a federal installation. I answered honestly, saying that I served in military logistics and had just returned from official duties earlier that morning. The officer gave a slight nod without asking about rank or position. Instead, he quietly stepped aside, removed his portable radio, and then reached for his department telephone. Whatever information he intended to confirm, I could tell from years of reading people that the conversation he was about to have was no longer about a simple neighborhood misunderstanding. The senior officer walked several yards away before placing the call, lowering his voice enough that none of us could hear more than an occasional word carried by the light morning breeze. I remained beside my truck with my hands resting comfortably in my pockets while Linda continued explaining to anyone willing to listen that she had done exactly what any responsible neighbor should have done. She seemed almost disappointed that the officers were taking their time instead of immediately asking me to leave. The younger officer maintained a professional attitude, occasionally glancing between me, Linda, and the small group of neighbors who had quietly gathered along the sidewalks. Nobody spoke very loudly anymore. The energy on the street had shifted from certainty to curiosity. A few minutes later, the senior officer returned, but instead of handing back my identification immediately, he asked if we could speak privately near the edge of the driveway. I agreed without hesitation. Once we were a short distance away, he looked directly at me and said, in a noticeably more respectful tone, that he wanted to confirm one piece of information before closing the call. He asked whether I was currently assigned as the commanding officer of the Regional Military Logistics Command located less than 20 miles away. I answered honestly that I was. His expression remained composed, but I could see the realization settle across his face. He nodded once, thanked me for my service, and quietly apologized for the inconvenience, making it clear that his apology was not for responding to the call, but for the misunderstanding that had brought them there. I told him there was nothing to apologize for because he had done exactly what a good officer should do. He responded to a complaint, gathered facts, verified evidence, and remained impartial. That was professionalism, and I respected it. He smiled briefly before returning my driver's license, and adding that someone from the installation had confirmed my assignment almost immediately after hearing my name. While we spoke, Linda watched from several yards away with growing impatience. She clearly sensed that the conversation was not unfolding the way she expected. When the officer walked back toward her, she immediately asked whether they were removing me from the property. Instead of answering directly, he calmly explained that the matter had been resolved and that I was the verified homeowner. For a brief moment, she looked genuinely confused, as though the facts refused to fit the conclusion she had already accepted. She insisted there had to be some mistake because she had never seen me living there consistently. The officer politely reminded her that travel schedules did not determine property ownership and that identification, official records, and verified information had already confirmed everything they needed. The conversation ended without raised voices, accusations, or dramatic confrontation. The patrol officers thanked everyone for their cooperation and prepared to leave. As they returned to their vehicle, the senior officer paused beside me one final time and quietly said that someone from the installation might contact me later simply to document the unusual circumstances surrounding the incident. I nodded, thinking little of the comment at the time. What I did not know was that before the afternoon was over, a formal report would begin moving through official channels. And by the following morning, Linda Parker would receive a notification instructing her to report to a government office she had never expected to enter, where the assumptions made on my driveway would be reviewed under a very different standard than neighborhood opinion. The next morning began like hundreds of others during my career, long before sunrise, with a cup of black coffee resting beside a stack of briefing folders on my desk. The headquarters building was already alive with quiet efficiency as civilian specialists, enlisted personnel, and officers prepared for another day coordinating shipments, equipment readiness, and support operations across several installations. The polished hallway outside my office reflected the soft glow of overhead lights, while the American flag stood motionless beside the command emblem mounted on the wall. Inside my office, nothing suggested drama. There were no raised voices, no emergency meetings, only the steady rhythm of professionals doing their jobs. Shortly after 7:30, my executive officer knocked lightly before stepping inside with a small folder in his hand. He explained that the local police department had submitted an informational report concerning an interaction involving a senior military commander and a civilian misunderstanding. The report had reached our legal liaison because standard protocol encouraged documentation whenever official duties or military leadership could become connected to public interactions, even indirectly. I opened the folder and quietly read every page without interruption. The officers had written an objective account, noting that I had fully cooperated, presented valid identification, answered every question respectfully, and never attempted to use my position to influence the situation. Their professionalism impressed me. They had also documented that the reporting individual continued disputing verified information even after ownership had been confirmed. I closed the folder and thanked my executive officer for ensuring everything had been processed correctly. A few minutes later, our installation legal advisor arrived with another update. It turned out that Linda Parker served as a volunteer civilian coordinator for a regional community outreach committee that occasionally partnered with our installation during charity drives, military family appreciation events, and educational programs. Because of that affiliation, the outreach office believed it would be appropriate to schedule a formal meeting to review expectations for future cooperation and respectful engagement with military personnel and community members alike. The purpose was educational, not punitive. The meeting request carried my office because I served as the commanding officer responsible for those partnership programs. I sat quietly for a moment, considering the unusual coincidence. Out of hundreds of community volunteers, the same woman who had confidently accused me of trespassing on my own property now needed to attend an official meeting inside the very headquarters where I worked every day. I gave only one instruction. I told my staff that the meeting would proceed exactly like every other professional appointment. There would be no special treatment, no unnecessary attention, and absolutely no discussion of personal embarrassment. We would focus only on facts, expectations, and mutual respect. Late that afternoon, my administrative assistant confirmed that the notification had been delivered and acknowledged. Linda Parker was scheduled to report to headquarters the following morning at 9 o'clock. She had no idea who occupied the command office listed on the appointment notice. To her, it was simply another government meeting. To me, it was an opportunity to demonstrate that genuine authority never seeks revenge. It simply allows truth, professionalism, and accountability to speak louder than assumptions ever could. At precisely 9 o'clock the following morning, my administrative assistant quietly informed me that Linda Parker had arrived at headquarters and completed the visitor check-in process. Through the security camera positioned outside my office, I watched her follow an escort down the polished hallway, her eyes moving from the framed unit citations to the photographs of humanitarian missions, disaster relief operations, and military logistics teams serving communities across the country. She appeared curious but completely unaware of why the meeting had been assigned to the commanding officer instead of a civilian coordinator. I stood for a moment beside the large window overlooking the installation before returning to my desk. The same leather folder containing the police report rested neatly beside that morning's operational briefing. Nothing about my office suggested intimidation. Family photographs shared space with books on leadership, logistics, and public service. The American flag stood beside the organizational colors, and the only sound came from the steady ticking of the wall clock. A gentle knock interrupted the silence. My assistant opened the door and announced that our scheduled visitor had arrived. I thanked her and invited Linda inside. She stepped through the doorway with a polite smile that disappeared almost instantly the moment our eyes met. For several seconds, she simply stood there without speaking, her expression shifting from confidence to surprise and finally, to complete disbelief. It was obvious she recognized me immediately. I recognized the exact moment she connected the quiet man standing in his driveway with the officer sitting behind the command desk. I greeted her with the same calm voice I had used the previous morning and invited her to take a seat. She slowly lowered herself into the chair across from my desk, still looking around the office as though she expected someone else to enter and explain that a mistake had been made. No one came. We were alone except for the official record keeper seated quietly near the side of the room, whose role was simply to document community partnership meetings according to standard procedure. Linda finally broke the silence by saying she had not realized where I worked. I replied that was true because I had never believed my profession should determine how neighbors treated one another. I explained that I intentionally kept my military responsibilities separate from my personal life because every resident deserved the same courtesy regardless of occupation. She lowered her eyes and admitted that she had relied on assumptions instead of facts. I nodded, not to criticize her, but to acknowledge the honesty of her statement. I then opened the folder containing the police report and carefully reviewed the documented sequence of events, emphasizing that every officer involved had acted professionally by verifying information before reaching conclusions. I praised their restraint and impartiality because those qualities protected everyone involved. Linda listened quietly as she realized that the meeting was not about punishment or embarrassment. It was about accountability, judgment, and the responsibility that comes with believing you are acting on behalf of a community. By the time we finished reviewing the report, the atmosphere inside the office had completely changed. There was no hostility remaining, only an unmistakable understanding that respect begins with questions, not assumptions, and that genuine authority is measured far more by humility than by titles displayed on an office door. After we finished reviewing the report, I closed the folder and allowed a few seconds of silence to settle across the room. In my experience, silence often gave people the opportunity to reflect more honestly than another lecture ever could. Linda finally looked up and quietly admitted that she had convinced herself she was protecting the neighborhood without ever considering how easily appearances could be misleading. I thanked her for saying that because accepting responsibility was always the first step toward rebuilding trust. I explained that this meeting had never been about my position, my rank, or the events that unfolded on my driveway. It was about something much larger. Every organization, whether it was a neighborhood association, a police department, or a military command, depended on people making decisions based on verified facts instead of assumptions. The moment confidence replaced evidence, good intentions could create unnecessary problems for innocent people. The legal advisor then reviewed the purpose of our community partnership program. Volunteers who represented local organizations were expected to encourage cooperation, respectful communication, and accurate reporting whenever concerns arose. Asking questions before making accusations was not simply courteous. It was one of the expectations attached to the partnership itself. Linda listened carefully and acknowledged that she had failed to meet that standard during our interaction. She also expressed appreciation for the responding police officers, admitting that they had remained patient even after she insisted they should accept her opinion without additional verification. Hearing her recognize their professionalism impressed me more than any apology directed toward me personally. I explained that the officers deserve credit because they had demonstrated exactly how public service should work. They responded without prejudice, verified documentation, remained respectful, and resolved the situation peacefully. That was the outcome every community should hope for. Before the meeting concluded, I offered one suggestion rather than a warning. I encouraged Linda to use her natural interest in helping the neighborhood more constructively by introducing herself to new residents instead of assuming they did not belong. A simple welcome conversation could prevent misunderstandings that no official report ever could. She smiled for the first time since entering the office and admitted that greeting people probably worked much better than calling the police before asking a single question. Even the legal advisor allowed himself a small smile at that observation. We documented the discussion as a completed educational meeting, noted that no further administrative action was necessary, and officially closed the matter. As Linda stood to leave, she paused near the door and sincerely apologized for the assumptions she had made. I accepted her apology without hesitation because holding resentment would have accomplished nothing. She thanked everyone in the room for treating her with dignity despite her mistake, then quietly walked down the hallway toward the exit. Watching the door close behind her, I realized the most important outcome had never been proving that I held authority. It had been demonstrating that real leadership does not seek opportunities to embarrass people when they are wrong. Instead, it creates opportunities for them to leave wiser than they arrived, allowing professionalism, fairness, and simple human respect to accomplish what anger never could. Several weeks passed before the neighborhood truly settled back into its familiar rhythm. But something subtle had changed in ways that no homeowner association meeting or community newsletter could ever measure. The same sidewalks filled with evening walkers, children rode bicycles beneath the tall oak trees, and lawn mowers hummed across neatly trimmed yards every Saturday morning. Yet conversations felt different. People paused a little longer before making assumptions, introduced themselves to unfamiliar faces instead of quietly watching from across the street, and seemed to understand that every neighbor carried a story that could not be judged from a driveway or a first impression. I returned to the routine I had always preferred. Each morning I left before sunrise for headquarters, and each evening I came home as nothing more than Ethan, the quiet neighbor who enjoyed grilling on weekends, maintaining his yard, and waving to families walking their dogs after dinner. My position never changed, but neither did my desire to keep it separate from my personal life. Leadership belonged inside the command headquarters. Home belonged to ordinary life. One Saturday afternoon, while I was replacing a weathered section of my backyard fence, I heard footsteps approaching along the sidewalk. I looked up and saw Linda carrying a small plate of homemade cookies covered neatly with a kitchen towel. She smiled with the kind of quiet humility that cannot be practiced because it only appears after someone has learned an important lesson. She thanked me once again for treating her with fairness instead of embarrassment during our meeting. Then she surprised me by explaining that she had started welcoming every new family moving into the neighborhood with a handwritten card and a simple introduction instead of suspicious questions. She laughed softly and admitted that she had discovered conversations solved far more problems than assumptions ever had. I told her that sounded like a much stronger way to build a community than trying to police one. Over the following months, I noticed the difference myself. New neighbors were greeted with smiles instead of skepticism. Delivery drivers received friendly directions instead of unnecessary questioning. Even local police officers occasionally stopped by neighborhood events, not because someone had called about suspicious activity, but because they had been invited to meet the community they served. Watching those conversations reminded me that trust grows slowly, one respectful interaction at a time. Looking back, the most unforgettable moment was never the police cruiser parked beside my driveway or the silence that filled my command office when Linda realized who I was. The moment that stayed with me was much quieter. It was seeing someone choose humility over pride after discovering that being wrong did not have to become a permanent part of who they were. My father used to tell me that the strongest leaders were the ones who never needed to remind people they were in charge. After everything that happened, I finally understood exactly what he meant. Authority can open doors, but character determines what happens after you walk through them. That morning on my driveway began with assumptions and uncertainty, but it ended by reminding an entire neighborhood that respect should never depend on a uniform, a job title, an expensive house, or the opinion of someone standing across the street. It should begin with a simple question, an open mind, and the willingness to let truth speak before judgment ever does.